Hey, welcome back. Today I want to talk to you about allegory. Allegory is a one-to-one symbolic correspondence that reveals a truth in a narrative. You probably could do it in poetry too, but typically it's a sort of story that everything is symbolic in. I'm going to talk to you about a couple of allegories, and you are going to be reading an allegory, Young Goodman Brown by Nathaniel Hawthorne. And I will talk more about Nathaniel Hawthorne in a minute. Let's go back to more of the beginnings of Western culture, and we have the allegory of Plato's cave. Now, Plato was the disciple of Socrates, and he was also the teacher of his disciple Aristotle, as one of my roosters just decided to emphasize. These are what I call the three greats in Greek philosophy: Socrates, Plato, Aristotle. Socrates, like most great leaders in Western culture who impacted our thought, did not ever write anything down that he said. He spent his life teaching, not recording. Akin to Confucius in Asia, akin to Jesus in the Middle East. None of them wrote down what they taught, and yet they impacted our world and continue to impact it to today. Now, Plato writes down this allegory of the cave in the dialogue called Symposium. This dialogue of Symposium basically consists of a bunch of smart people getting together over drinks to talk about the beginnings of the world. Now I have a rooster chorus, apparently. Symposium today means usually an academic sort of conference or training, but the original term means a drinking party where smart people talk. And at this drinking party, in the dialogue of the Symposium, they talk about the beginnings of the world and humanity. One person talks about an idea that I'm going to call twinning, where this person they're talking about the creation of humankind, and this person says, well, one of the stories that's told is that in the beginning, everybody, all of humanity was created paired, hooked together. And in those pairs you had male, female, and mostly male, female, and female, female. And because people were hooked together, people had to learn how to cooperate with each other, to take care of each other. And the gods looked down on all these male-female pairs, male-male pairs, and female-female pairs, and realized that they'd made a mistake. Because by learning how to cooperate with each other, humanity was going to become too powerful. So Zeus threw a thunderbolt down and split everyone apart so that they would spend the rest of their lives looking for their missing half. Now, in modern parlance, what do we call the person that completes you, that is your missing half, that makes you whole? We call that your soulmate. And Lord knows that billions of dollars are being made off of people looking for their soulmate. Maybe some of you believe in that concept of soulmate, That concept has been around for more than 2,000 years. When it comes to Socrates' turn during the symposium, he talks about a cave. And this is how he describes the condition of humanity. That humanity, when humanity was created, everybody is in a cave. And so here we have everybody living in this cave. And if any of you have been into a cave before, it is completely dark. And so people live in darkness. And while they're living there, they don't know anything different. They don't know anything different at all. Just that this is how life is. We live underground in darkness. Every once in a while, once in a great while, somebody will build a fire. Most people won't even look at the fire. I don't know about you, but I like fires. I love to watch the way the different flames, the different heights of the flames, the different colors as things get burned. But in this allegory, people tend not even to look at the flame because it hurts their eyes. They're not used to the light. Most people are more comfortable watching the shadows cast on the wall. Let me see if I can find a black pen to write shadows in. Nope. Alright, pretend this is black. So most people, most humans, are happy to just watch the shadows from the fire. And when the fire goes out, they don't really miss it. But every once in a while, you have a person who wants to go up. Towards the sun and to see the light. And that person will start heading up towards the surface where there is the sun, where there is the light. But most often that person gets frightened and will head right back into the utmost darkness of the cave. But every once in a while, once in a very, very great while, a person will come out into the sun and into the light and love it. And that person who loves the light, who loves the sun, spends the rest of his or her life going back into the cave and trying to help as many other people out of darkness into the light. I want you to take a moment and think about a term that means that one is a part of the light. That word is, and there are others, but enlightenment. And the person who loves to breathe enlightenment into others, according to Plato's dialogue on the cave, Socrates' word is a philosopher, meaning Philo means love. Sophie is the goddess of wisdom. That person becomes a lover of wisdom, and lovers of wisdom spend their whole lifetime bringing people out of the darkness and into the light. Or we could say, in an allegory, out of ignorance or non-knowing into knowledge. Now I want you to look at this cave and the idea that we have a dark space and then above it a light space. What anatomical organ that is on half of our population would this cave represent symbolically in an allegory? So half of the population of humanity has an organ where somebody is in there and it's dark and it's comfortable, and yet that person has to come out into the light. This would be the womb. And think about that. All of us come from a womb. Now maybe in another 50 years people will be born in decanters, I don't know, in artificial wombs. But for right now, everybody on our earth, all 7+ billion people who live here, we have all come from a womb where we grew in darkness, and it was comforting to grow there. And yet we were expelled through labor into the light. And what do babies do when they come out of their mamas? What is the first thing that they do besides gasp for breath? Babies cry. Because, why? Well, one, it's not as comfortable as it was in the warm darkness. Two, they're being taken away from that comfort. And three, it is so bright, it is blinding. Our eyes have never seen the light. And this metaphor, this idea of coming into the light, it shows that enlightenment is painful. It's frightening. It's scary. And what do we want to do? Get back into that womb. And you'll hear people say, that's just a mama's baby. Why? Because they're not standing up individually in their enlightened state. They just want the comfort of mom. And all of us love our mothers. Why wouldn't we, right? They gave us life. And it's hard to go away from that comforting, warm darkness and actually embrace our individuality. There's a reason why when women are giving birth, it's called labor. Labor means work. It takes a lot of work. And possibly the most painful rebirth people can have is birthing themselves. And what I mean by that is we all grow up with the security of our traditional beliefs that we inherit. And then we have to go out into the world of knowledge, and weigh what we got taught to what we learn and what we want to keep from the old versus what we want to keep from the new. And I call that birthing oneself into enlightenment. As an example, in my case, I was brought up in a very conservative cult called Mormonism, and I was taught all sorts of fantastical ideas about the world as truth. I was taught that, okay, you can go to school and study science, but just know that that is not truth. imagine the consternation of my mother when I came home in kindergarten, it was kindergarten, and said, "So Mom, if the world is only 6,000 years old, how did dinosaurs live here millions of years ago?" And she looked at me and she said, "Well, Warren, we don't know what God used to make this planet. Maybe he took a world where dinosaurs used to live and used that material to make this one." And as a kindergartner, I was like, "Oh, okay." All right. I was also taught, learn science, but don't believe it. That continued to become a problem. Now in first grade, I was learning how to read. I'd started in kindergarten, but I didn't get good at reading until towards the last half of first grade. And by then, they were doing an experiment on us, and the stories that I was reading were Greek mythology. And I loved them. And many of these stories were about Hercules and all of his exploits and conquests. And I came home, I'll never forget it, and I said to my mom, "Hey Mom, I was wondering, I think that Hercules is a lot like Jesus." And she looked at me and said, "Well, Warren, maybe those stories are based on the life of Jesus. We just don't know that." And as a first grader, I'm like, "Oh, okay, that's a way to work it out." Even though Jesus didn't exist until hundreds upon hundreds upon hundreds of years after the myths surrounding Hercules and the gods in Greece were already birthed. There is a phrase from the Bible that I really like, and that I think captures this element that enlightenment is not always easy. And that phrase is, increased knowledge leads to increased sorrow. And that comes from the book of Ecclesiastes, which happens to be my favorite biblical book. Increased knowledge leads to increased sorrow. Why would that be? You who are watching this right now, you want more knowledge, right? You want more knowledge. But just as in the myth of Adam and Eve, where the fruit of the tree of knowledge leads to death and all sorts of punishments, the same thing goes by increasing one's knowledge, in the sense that if you don't know about children dying of hunger, you can't be sad about it. But if you learn about that, then maybe you will be sad and you'll want to do something. If you don't understand, for example, climate change, then ignorance is bliss. That's also a verse from the Bible. It's not a verse that's praising ignorance, but that's there. On the other hand, if you realize we are slowly killing our planet, and that's going to not just kill plants, animals, bacteria, but it will eventually kill us, then you have to have a little bit of sorrow over that. So enlightenment itself has to do not just with the struggle of coming into the knowledge, but doing something about it, such as lovers of knowledge, philosophers, who spend their lives helping to bring others out of the darkness. So to summarize, once again, there's a one-to-one symbolic correspondence that reveals the truth. In the allegory of Plato's cave, The truth is that enlightenment takes time. It's not easy. Not everybody wants knowledge. And even if you want knowledge, sometimes it's too frightening, and so you go back to your past. But once you get it, once you become enlightened, once you become a Buddha, as in Buddhism, Buddha means an enlightened one. So the Buddha is Siddhartha, who started Buddhism, but anybody can become a Buddha. I'm not saying you have to change your religion, okay? I am just saying anybody can become a Buddha, an enlightened one, by seeking out knowledge. And if you do that, as in Plato's cave, you spend your life helping others. Now I'd like to talk to you about the parable of the prodigal son. And this is a parable. A parable means a tale that tells the truth, which is what allegories do, as told by Jesus. And I'm using the parable of the prodigal son. It's recorded in the Gospel according to Luke, chapter 15, verses 11 through 32. And I am using the translation of the New International Version. And why instead of the King James? Because it's more clear. It's a more recent translation, so it's easier to understand. So this is the parable of the prodigal son, Luke chapter 15, verses 11 through 32. And in this parable, hopefully you've gotten these verses. You're going to have a father a young son, and an older son. There was a man, Jesus continued, there was a man who had 2 sons. The younger one said to his father, "Father, give me my share of the estate." Can you imagine going up to your parents and saying, "Dad, I want the cash." Or, "Mom, I want the cash. Just divide your property and give it to me now." Typically that doesn't happen until after your parents die, right? If there's anything left over after they're buried. And so the father divided his property between them, between the older son and the younger son. Not long after that, the younger son got together all he had, all of his money, set off for a distant country, and there he squandered his wealth in wild living. So the younger son takes the cash and travels abroad and throws a party that lasts as long as his cash lasts. After he'd spent everything, there was a severe famine in that whole country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to a citizen of that country, who sent him to his fields to feed pigs. Now, well, we're just going to be stuck with these 2 colors. So he goes from rich to having to feed pigs. And in Jewish tradition, pigs are unclean, which means that if you came in contact with a pig, that you yourself would become unclean, and you would have to do a ritual bath so that you could become clean again. So here he is feeding pigs, and he longed to fill his stomach with the pods that the pigs were eating. So he's throwing slop to pigs and thinking, that looks good. But no one gave him anything. So he starts out rich, and he ends up poor. Why? Well, we'll talk about why in a minute. When he came to his senses, he said, how many of my father's hired servants have food to spare, and here I am starving to death? I will set out and go back to my father and say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired servants. So he jettisons this idea that, I'm big and bad, and my dad's rich, and I'm rich too because of that too. I just hope my dad makes me a servant because they have a life better than me after what I've done so foolishly. So he got up and he went to his father. But while he was a long way off, his father saw him, and his father was filled with compassion for him. He ran to his son, the father did, and threw his arms around him and kissed him. And the son said, Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. So he confesses his weakness, right? But his father said to his servants, quick, bring the best robe and put it on him. This is my robe. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. Why would the dad need to order the servants to bring sandals for his son? Why? Because he was barefoot. That's how impoverished he was. Bring the fattened calf and kill it. Let's have a feast and celebrate, for this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. And so they began to celebrate it. By the way, what is the food? What do we call the food that comes from a fattened calf? It's veal. I don't know how many of you have had veal. I've had it one time in my life. It was delicious. And the only time I had it, I didn't know at the time how you made it so delicious. And that was and that continues to be, by boxing up a little cow and not letting it move so that its muscles don't get tough. So it's in a cage where it can't move, and you just fatten it and fatten it and fatten it, and then you get very, very tender, fatty meat. And so they began to celebrate. Meanwhile, so the story goes back now to the older son. Meanwhile, the older son was in the field, and when he came near the house, he heard music and dancing. So the dad has ordered out for a band to come and for entertainers to come. And so he called one of the servants and he asked him what was going on. And the servant told him, your brother has come, and your father has killed the fattened calf because he has him back safe and sound. The older brother became angry and refused to go in. And so his father went out and pleaded with him. But he answered his father, look, all these years I've been slaving for you, never disobeyed your orders, yet you never gave me even a young goat so I could celebrate with my friends. And goat at this time would be cheaper, right? But when this son of yours who has squandered your property with prostitutes comes home, you kill the fattened calf for him. So he's talking about reality. The younger son, what I like to summarize it with, spent all of his money on women, whiskey, and sin. Or in today's parlance, if Jesus were telling this parable, it wouldn't say, and he went off to a foreign land. It would say, and then he bought himself a Learjet and flew all over the world, where he threw parties full of cocaine and heroin and barbiturates and meth. And he had a bunch of friends who would celebrate and party with him. And he went to the best brothels, and he had the best prostitutes, is how it would be in a contemporary version. So the dad listens to that, and he says, my son, you are always with me, and everything I have is yours. But we had to celebrate and be glad because this brother of yours was dead, and is alive again. He was lost and is found. So, what we have here, if we look at this allegorically, and many of you, if you've been to church, have probably been taught this. But if not, it doesn't matter. I can teach you about it. We have a young son. We have a dad who's rich, right? Who's got the cash. A young son who wants the cash now. And so this young son is very impatient. He wants it now. He has a need for greed. All right? He has no impulse control. Why? Because he's young. You may have seen this. I see it sometimes. I see students who come from poverty, who get student loans, and they're still impoverished because they don't have jobs, but they get a student loan, and all of a sudden they want to live better than their parents lived. Or they have a little bit left over, and so what do? Get a tattoo. Even though that money could be useful for next semester when you need to buy a book or pay your tuition again. Why? Because there's not enough experience and understanding about how the cash can run out if you're not going to have self-control. And the younger son not only loves living high, he loves imbibing, he loves fooling around, paying people to have sex with him. You can see this happen in professional sports all the time, where a young person gets a contract and all of a sudden they have an entourage. And that entourage is with them wherever they go. And they're his or her buddies. And yet, apparently my dogs don't like entourages. It's a horse coming by. Quiet, puppies. Quiet, puppies.
Hey! Quiet!
Quiet, puppies. It's two horses. It's an entourage. Anyway, so he doesn't have enough life experience to exercise self-restraint. Meanwhile, and the dad is very, he loves his children, and he's very generous. Meanwhile, the older son doesn't go and party, doesn't go spend money on prostitutes. Where is he when the younger son gets back after all this time? He's out in the field. What is he doing out in the field? He is working. He is working. And yet the father continues to love both of them. Now, in a simple allegorical way, we could say, who is the father? The father is God. Who is the younger son? The younger son is the sinner. Who is the older son? He is the faithful believer. And, amazingly, this Father God loves both of them. Does that seem fair? You can decide. Now, in the tradition I grew up in, people would talk about how petty the older son was. I don't think so. I think it's a good question to say, what the hell? All these years, it's been years, I have been slaving away for you, and you haven't even given me a goat to go and have fun with my friends, to have a party. And why didn't the father give that to him? He never asked. He never even thought to ask. He was waiting. And the father says to him, look, everything I have is yours. Which is, if you want to have a party with your friends, you can go ahead and do that. But I still love your brother, who was once dead, but now is alive. All right, so for your assignment that you're going to be reading, you're going to be reading another allegory. We could get much more detailed and more analytical about the allegory of the prodigal son, or the parable of the prodigal son, but we're going to move on. You're going to be reading Young Goodman Brown. And this is a short story. By Nathaniel Hawthorne. Now, Nathaniel Hawthorne is part of the foundation of American literature, and by that I mean literature from the United States of America. You may recognize his name from writing the famous novel. Oh, I should put it in red for you, since it is called The Scarlet Letter, which it continues to be a bestseller hundreds of years after it was published. All right? Now, if you look at, in The Scarlet Letter, by the way, this famous novel that Nathaniel Hawthorne wrote, it takes place in Salem during the Puritan times. And you can go and look up what Puritanism means, because it continues to influence our culture to this day. Very religious community. These are some of the first European immigrants who came here. And in The Scarlet Letter, you have a woman whose husband has gone away and never come back for years. And all of a sudden she's pregnant. And obviously she's not pregnant from her husband. And so she's condemned to wear the Scarlet Letter, which is a letter A that stands for adultery. And so she has to wear this big letter A. So everywhere she goes, any time that she interacts with people, people look down on her because she's an adulteress. Now in Young Goodman Brown, it's also an allegory, just as Plato's Cave and the Prodigal Son.
Okay.
Just by looking at this title here, and his name, Good Man. The story is about a good man. And lo and behold, who is he married to? He's a newlywed with his wife, Faith. And so this is an allegory of spirituality, where the young good man is going to go off into the night, and he's not going to be very happy with what he finds, and it's going to change his life. As you're reading it, I want you to make sure that you keep these concepts in mind. That in traditional Christianity, the soul is made up of three major powers: memory, understanding, and free will. These are the three major powers of the soul. Two minor powers are fantasy and imagination. All right? The three enemies of the soul are the world, the devil, and the flesh. And in traditional Christianity, what is the desire of the soul? Where does the soul want to go? The soul wants to go back to the Garden of Eden before the fall. The soul wants to go to heaven. Now in in the tradition of mysticism in Christianity, which I don't mean mysticism like, whoa. I mean it's a philosophy, it's a movement within not just Christianity. Also it happens in Islam, it happens in Judaism as well. But in mysticism, the soul longs to get back with God. And there are three paths. There are three paths. The illuminative path, the purgative path, and the unitive path. All three of these are necessary. None are the wrong path. Illuminative means that there's an illumination. Think of Saul who becomes Paul. He has theophany, which is he hears the voice of the divine. Saul, Saul, why persecutest thou me? And then he becomes blind after that because he's also seen a great light. And he takes time and he goes from persecuting Christians to becoming the leading Christian, the person who wrote most of the New Testament. Okay, so illumination. Purgative means purifying. That there are things that are going to happen even once you've found the divine and want to be with the divine. You're going to go through troubles. And then unitive is when you actually are united with the divine. Now the problem is that even if you're united with the divine, you still live on earth. You can't stay in heaven while you're in corporeal form. And so that doesn't last for all that much time. There are just moments when you feel like you're in the presence of the divine. And in between all these paths are dark nights of the soul. And those are times when you can't see the light. When you feel despair, you feel abandoned. What modern psychology might call depression. But you go through these even if you've become illuminated. Even if you're being purified, there are times when you feel like you just want to give up. Now, two of the greatest mystics in Western culture are people from the 1500s. And I just want to write their names so that you can know this. You don't have to write on them, but you have Saint Teresa of Avila and John and Saint John. They're both saints now. They weren't back when they were doing their work. Saint John of the Cross. And together, Saint Teresa was a nun. Saint John of the Cross, back in the 1500s in Spain, he was a priest, a father. And they created the Carmelite movement. And the Carmelites were nuns and priests who embraced poverty, chastity, and faithfulness, loyalty. They also were called los descalzados, the shoeless ones, because in order to show that they weren't concerned about the material world, they went without shoes. Not just in public, not when they were working in the fields only, not when they were walking the streets only, but always. They never wore shoes, even as they tried to help the poor. All right, and Saint Teresa of Avila, not the modern-day Saint Teresa who did a lot of her missionary work in Africa. She was named after this saint. Saint Teresa, she had visions of Jesus, and she would go to her confessor and talk about these visions, and the confessor would tell her, you know, you're a woman, you must be hallucinating. And she kept having these visions. And so in order to punish her, he told her, well, you need to write all this down. And so she did. And she wrote her mystical experiences down in what became a spiritual autobiography called Castillos Interiores, which literally translates as interior castles. You can find it other names translated into English because they don't translate it literally. That spiritual autobiography from the 1500s has been a bestseller for more than 400 years. I bet her father confessor didn't realize what he was doing with somebody who was committed, somebody who wanted to be on that path of illumination, of refinement, of purgation, and of unity with the divine. So think about this idea of the dark night of the soul when you read young Goodman Brown, because he's going to go out into his dark night of the soul looking for something more than his faith, than his newly married wife. And I want you to think about, when does his dark night of the soul end? Or does it? Once again, you'll find Allegory from young Goodman Brown, also as we talked about in Plato's Cave, and the Prodigal Son. Thank you so much.